Strange days. Something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. So goes a hugely popular song from the 60s, sung by Buffalo Springfield. Meanwhile, Jim Morrison of the rock group The Doors sang "Break On Through to the Other Side." A decade later, John Lennon sang "Strange Days Indeed, Most Peculiar Mama." That was in the late 70s. Not long afterwards, he was murdered. Most recently of all, the group REM enjoyed enormous success singing "It's the End of the World as We Know It," and then parenthetically singing "And I Feel Fine." My point is that there is something happening here, something unprecedented in the entire history of this planet as far as we are able to know. There are powerful factors and influences at work in our world now that have the capacity to change us and our world in radical ways, for good or ill. My point also is that this unprecedented situation, like the "break on through to the other side" lyric indicates, has something to do with birth feelings, birth trauma, and emerging perinatal unconscious. Perinatal meaning events surrounding birth. So what I'm saying is that we have pain from birth and we repress it. It becomes part of our unconscious. It becomes our perinatal unconscious. Now, what I have in mind in this book is to attempt to reawaken you to the unique character of our times. Then I expect to persuade you that this unprecedented era in history is rife with the perinatal, that is, with things having to do with the time around our births. This contemporary age is permeated by perinatal symbolism, elements, evidence, behavior, rituals, and situations. In other words, I expect to show that the events of these strange days are being sculpted by an emerging perinatal unconscious, an unconscious that was created out of the trauma of our entering into this world, our birth trauma. Finally, I intend to say a few words about what might be the outcome of these emerging perinatal trends. New Age or Apocalypse? Strange days. For most people, I would assume that I am not telling you anything new and pointing out that our times are unique. For that matter, all times are unique, unlike any other. But what no other time has seen is the actual, not imagined, possibility, even likelihood of the end of the world. That is to say, of the end of our species and maybe all life on this planet along with us. Considering just one scenario, we have the capacity, with only a minuscule amount of our nuclear weapons, to wipe out all life on this planet. We all know this. I used the phrase just now, "end of the world," deliberately, for I expect that it will evoke in some a reaction that what I am going to say from here on will be a drawn-out verbal version of a familiar cartoon depicting a bearded and bedraggled man on a street corner carrying a sign or wearing a clapboard proclaiming "the end is near," and that what I will say will have just about as much credibility as that man's would. I take that chance to make my first point, which is the fact that we can so easily dismiss, ridicule, and smugly deride such ideas of apocalypse points to our complacency with the strangest and most precarious of days. In fact, we have lived with this unprecedented situation, dangling on a thread, as it were, above the abyss of nuclear annihilation, to name just one of the possible forces of extinction. Of course, we've all been talking about global warming, but nobody's really pointing out what the end results of that would be. Anyway, we've lived with these things for so long as for it to seem commonplace, as part of the normal and familiar furniture of our daily lives. Heads in the sand. It has become so much a part of our daily lives, in fact, that we hardly give it any thought anymore. But for a moment, let us just imagine a person from a previous time in history being somehow transported into this time and being made to understand the impending forces of environmental collapse, nuclear threat, population explosion, and so on. And unless this person was Nostradamus, we can imagine this person would be hugely alarmed, to say the least, and might well wonder at our nonchalance, or should we say apathy, in the face of such likely, not just potential, apocalypse. So I won't waste time pointing out the statistics that prove the premise that the current trends we are following are apocalyptic. For example, environmentally, with the depletion of the ozone layer, the rapid deforestation, or let us say the ravaging of the lungs of the planet, globally increasing air pollution, a dying off of the life of the oceans, the oxygen-producing plankton, and hence the basis of all life on this planet, the greenhouse effect, global warming, and so on, nor the nuclear threat, whether precipitated by terrorists, rogue nations, or accidents, the continuing explosion of the world's population leading to likely famine, wars, diseases, and so on, possibility of virulent epidemic that cannot be cured, as strains of microorganisms evolve that are immune to our much-touted antibiotics, the possibility of rogue nations, tyrants, or terrorists employing weapons of mass destruction, possibly leading to ever-mounting rounds of retaliation with eventually no one left standing. Or instead, the weapons, such as biological weapons, getting out of control and creating a worldwide epidemic. No, I won't go into supporting that premise. The evidence and statistics are there for all to see, published and promulgated by the best scientists of our time, mixed in with the more mundane messages of our daily newspapers and nightly newscasts, though we mostly turn our ears from them. In fact, if you are not already aware of the global crisis that besets us, I do not think you will get much out of reading or listening further, and would probably better spend your time doing something else. There will always be those that will have their heads in the sand and will cast about like flotsam upon the waters by the events swirling around them, impotent in the face of them and dependent upon others' actions for the result. Assuming you are not one of these, a good bet if you've managed to get to this paragraph. There is much to say about the current apocalyptic trends. Facing foursquare. But even those of us aware of this crisis hardly think of it. Of course, it is our normal psychic defenses that operate to keep this huge awareness out of our daily minds. We must do this in order to be able to function. But perhaps for some of us, our defenses work too well, so much so that we unthinkingly participate and contribute to our own demise. This is classic neurotic self-sabotaging self-destruction on a macro scale. However, psychologists, historians, psychohistorians, and scholars in the educated public claim not to be like that. It is their job, or their claim, to be looking squarely into the face of these forces of denial and potential apocalypse, and be seeking to understand the human condition and human psychology in light of them. It is their duty, then, to inform the rest of us about what they see so that we might have a chance of reversing our self-destructive tendencies. Like, well, this is what Al Gore tried to do. Anyway, whether the educated public and the multitude of scholars actually are fulfilling their mission in these times is debatable. Regardless, my thesis is that when we do this, when we look foursquare into the face of the global crisis and its accompanying denial, we find that these unprecedented global factors contribute to a unique and unprecedented human condition and psychology. I've seen a bumper sticker around in California where I live that proclaims, "If you're not angry, you're not paying attention." Could as easily say, however, if you're not alarmed, fearful, anxious, depressed, you name it, you're not paying attention. So then let us pay attention. This book that I'm reading is about facing foursquare into the fantastic circumstances and situation in which we find ourselves. Watching, like a photograph emerging in solution, as the face of these times slowly comes into view, and then waking up to the meaning of the message, perhaps the warning it brings us, so that we might live most fully and take up our roles consciously amid these unprecedented unfoldings. What is required of us now, then, having turned to receive the message, is to look deep into the features of our age. Let us begin.